so much for inviting me, because the folks here in the Nass Valley, the Nisga'a Nation, have been part of my life now for more than half a century. And I appreciate very much my visits to your nation, and despite everything that Deanna said about me, I mean, all of what she said was the good part. I remember when I became a judge, that was back in 1971, and hard to believe, but I was a comparatively young man at the time. And my father, who was a retired Mountie, he had served in the Mounted Police in Hazelton and other parts of BC and on the prairies, he said to me, well, Tom, now that you're a judge, just remember that there's a lot of wisdom out there on the farm and on the street and in the bush. And he said, don't think just because you've got a law degree, you're a judge now, you know it all. And he told me the story of a young judge newly appointed on the prairies years ago, who had was trying one of his first cases with a jury about a young man in a little prairie town, young man charged with stealing a horse. The evidence was called before the judge and the jury, and it was pretty strong. It looked as if he had indeed stolen the horse, but he was a nice young guy, and the jurors were prairie farmers, and the judge summed up the case and sent the jury out to consider their verdict. Is he guilty or not of stealing the horse? And the jury came back within a few minutes, and the judge said, have you reached a verdict? The foreman said, yes. He said, what is your verdict? And the foreman said, well, we find the defendant not guilty, but we think he should give the horse back. And the judge, preening himself on his newly acquired knowledge, said in a patronizing way, well, Mr. Foreman, members of the jury, that's what in law we call an inconsistent verdict. And I'll have to send you back to the jury room to reconsider it. So the jury went back to the jury room, came back a few minutes later, and the judge said, well, have you reached a verdict? And the foreman said, yes. We find the defendant not guilty, and we've decided he can keep the horse. So I just want to tell you at the very outset that I join in the congratulations that you've received from my colleagues on the podium, and I don't have any advice to add, but I do urge you to bear in mind all that they have said. I would like, though, to congratulate not only all of you, and I've had the pleasure of meeting the graduates because we had our photos taken together before the proceedings began, but I'd like to congratulate WWN, because it is remarkable that you've got a degree-granting institution here in the midst of a thriving First Nations community. And I think that's not only unusual, it may well, in Canada at least, be unique. And so I join in the congratulations offered to Deanna and to WWN. I would like to just spend a few minutes talking about history and my point will be, and I'll tell you what it is at the very beginning so that by the time I'm through, if it isn't clear, you'll know what I was trying to say. And that is about the history of the Nisga'a and the history of Canada, and how the history of the Nisga'a has merged with the history of Canada. Deanna pointed out that as early as 1913, the leaders of the Nisga'a Tribal Council had gone to London in the United Kingdom to plead their case before the king. And at that time, as Deanna points out, if you read the Nisga'a petition to the king, it included a whole list of concerns that they had, not only about the land and establishing their Aboriginal title to the land they had occupied for centuries, but they dealt with matters such as health and education. And that's the tradition of leadership that extends right through until the Nisga'a Treaty. And of course, Dr. Joseph Gosnell is here, who represents that tradition in the flesh. And of course, Eva Clayton, who is the bearer of that same tradition as your current president. Well, when Frank Calder, who was the president of the Nisga'a Tribal Council 50 years ago, came to my office and asked me if I would represent the Nisga'a in court. They wanted to sue the provincial government. They wanted the courts to declare that they had Aboriginal title to the Nass Valley. Now this, at the time, was a very daring step. I had gone to law school in the 1950s. Deanna pointed out I graduated in 1956. And I went to UBC, and that is where I met my wife. And we had a big old house, and some of the students used to use it as a kind of home away from home. And one day I was working upstairs. I was a judge at the time, and I heard a lot of laughter downstairs. And I went downstairs later and said, "What was that about?" And Bev said, "Well, some of the students, the women, the Native students, are going to protest the reduction in the payments provided by the federal government for Aboriginal students studying on campus." This used to be a subject of perpetual dispute. In any event, she said, they are going to occupy the offices of the Indian Affairs Department downtown, and they're going to stay for tonight, and they're going to stay for breakfast and maybe lunch. So I gave them some kitchen utensils, including an electric frying pan. So I thought no more of it, but I went down to the courthouse the next day because that was my job as a judge, and the Chief Justice phoned me and said, "Tom, there's some Aboriginal women who have occupied the offices of Indian Affairs, and the Justice Department is coming over here asking for an injunction to remove them." And he said, "I wonder if you would hear the case. Will you be the judge on this case?" And I said, "Well, Chief, I've got a bit of a problem." I said, "I think I may have a conflict of interest because," I said, "as we speak, our frying pan is being held hostage." So anyway, when Frank Calder came to see me back in the 60s, I was a law graduate, but I hadn't learned anything about Aboriginal title or Aboriginal rights in law school. The subject didn't exist. We were taught all kinds of things. We had a good legal education, except sitting right here in British Columbia and knowing that the province had been occupied by First Nations people for centuries before our ancestors came. It had never occurred to us, well, what rights did those folks have? And what is worse, didn't occur to us, the students, it hadn't apparently occurred to any of our professors. These subjects were not taught. They weren't on the curriculum. And that has changed remarkably. And the Nisga'a have had a lot to do with that. Because when I was a young lawyer, I took on a case involving hunting rights on Vancouver Island, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada, and I won it, so that I didn't become famous, but anybody who was interested in the subject of the rights of First Nations people might have come upon my name. And Frank Calder came to see me, and I had a little office, and my mother, who was a widow, worked for me. And Frank came with the 4 chiefs of the 4 villages, and they said to me, we want you to sue the government and establish Aboriginal title. And I have to say that I didn't know an awful lot about the subject, but I was just starting out in my own law practice, having worked for another firm for quite a few years, so I had plenty of time to study. And I was able to spend a couple of months in the library, and we went to court. We filed the lawsuit in the Supreme Court of British Columbia in 1967, which is, I think, now you folks would know the math, but I think that's 50 years ago. And I came up to Nass Valley and met the chiefs and the elders, and the Nisga'a had kept the flame going for all of those years. From 1913 until I turned up here in 1967, they said, we have Aboriginal title to the Nass Valley. Our people have occupied this land since time immemorial. Well, we started a lawsuit, but while the case was still pending, the Prime Minister of Canada, whose name in those days was Trudeau, and some of the folks on the platform will remember him, a very great Prime Minister and did much for our country, but he didn't believe in Aboriginal title. And he made a public speech at the time when asked about this lawsuit that the Nisga'a had brought. He said, well, I can't accept the idea of Aboriginal title. We can't live according to historical might-have-beens. And that might have discouraged some people, but it didn't discourage the Nisga'a. Frank Calder and I went to a meeting of chiefs in the Lower Mainland. Must have been 50 of them there. And I remember the meeting was held out in the Fraser Valley. And they said to us, they said, don't go ahead with this lawsuit. Give it up. You're going to lose. And then we'll have nothing. At least we can talk about Aboriginal title now, even though they don't accept it. And Frank and the Nisga'a chief said, no, this is our decision. We believe in it. We're going ahead. Well, in 1973, the Supreme Court decided by a vote of 6-1 that Aboriginal title was part of Canadian law. And Prime Minister Trudeau, to give him his due, he read the judgment and he said, I think I was wrong. I think there is such a thing as Aboriginal title, and he adopted a new policy on the part of the federal government. That is, he would settle all the Aboriginal title claims in Canada where no treaties had been made. And that is why, since that time, treaties have been made, and they're called modern treaties. And of course, the Nisga'a Treaty of the year 2000 is the exemplar of those treaties. That is why these modern treaties have been made all across northern Canada, including British Columbia, Yukon, Northwest Territories, Nunavut, northern Quebec, and Newfoundland. And these modern treaties cover about half the landmass of Canada. That, if you look at the map, it covers pretty much the northern half of Canada. And all of that was achieved by the Nisga'a, who never gave up, who believed in themselves and in their history and in the rights they held as a collectivity. That's where Nisga'a history merged with Canadian history. And the leadership that the Nisga'a have shown throughout those many years is something that Canadians are beginning to recognize, and I think it's something that is critical to the understanding of the history of our country. Because you see, these last 50 years and more have seen in Canada a blossoming of the rights of First Nations and Métis and Inuit, and a greater understanding on the part of Canadians. Just to talk about the law schools for a minute, there isn't a law school in the country that doesn't now teach the whole history of the emergence of Aboriginal title and Aboriginal rights. And as more of these modern treaties are developed, and you develop the institutions of self-government that the Nisga'a have done, perhaps to a greater extent than any other First Nation in the country, we have courses of study here in WWN, but in universities around the country. That's particularly in the law schools. So, if I can just talk about our history as a country, and I'm old enough, we're celebrating 150 years, and I go back a long way. I remember when we celebrated 100 years, for heaven's sake. And so I claim to have a perspective on Canadian history. And we celebrate in Canada the coming together of the English and the French on this continent in Confederation in 1867. The building of the railway from sea to sea. The contribution Canada made to the defense of democracy in the First and Second World Wars, not to forget the contribution that Aboriginal people made as soldiers in both of those wars. We celebrate such national achievements as Medicare. And I think we should celebrate as well, and all the students in our schools, whether they're First Nations or not, should be studying that struggle that has gone on for so many years to establish the special and yet contemporary place of Aboriginal people in our country and in our lives. So there are some little kids in the back of the room who I think have had enough of this. So it may be time for me to conclude by expressing my congratulations and by saying to all of you how pleased I am to have played a small part in the history of the Nisga'a Nation. Thanks very much.
Just a few words before we present a gift to Tom. Tom has a Nisga'a name. His name is Samagit Alaydim Khlawit. Alaydim Khlawit. Alayt in our language, to me, means a spiritual healer, the body as well as the spirit. And what is attached to his name is the name of our survival mountain. When you go leave the hall, you look across and you're going to see this big mountain. That big mountain is called Khlawit. Khlawit. I asked my father what the name meant, and he said the meaning of the name got lost over time. It goes so far back in the history of our people. And so the present that will be given to Tom is the drum. And on this drum, the four major crests of our nation are on it. How can we thank a man that helped us so much? And not just in Nisga'a, other Aboriginal people across the country and, in my view, around the world, what this man has done. So, Tom, we want to present you with this present. Tá iqsabnain al-qisqat lugala ilqadan samagit lula ilqadan imad naqsl anonan asno ano yuqtaq kulawil qaniyam iaguniyan awam aguniyan awam imaq wala akalsan qanwal khask tá iqsabnain samagit. Thank you.
Okay, Bobby, do you want to, and Tom, Bob's going to present you also with a certificate to go with that.
Doigsanine Diana. Justice Berger, I'll just read this certificate to you. Wilpelhaus Nisga'a Institute. The chairperson of the Wilpelhaus Nisga'a Institute, upon the recommendation and approval of the Wilpelhaus Nisga'a Institute Board of Governors, has conferred the degree of Honorary Nisga'a Certificate of Appreciation to Thomas Berger, in witness whereof, and by the authority duly committed to us, we have hereunto set our hand and seal. Goodwin, BC, May 2017. Signed by Deanna Nice, President and CEO of Wilpelhaus Nisga'a, and Arthur Isaac, Chairperson of the Board of Governors.
Please rise and join us in thanking Tom. Please rise and join us in thanking Tom. Thanks. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. So now comes the most important part. All parts of the ceremony are important, but now comes a more important time for these folks to receive the degrees and certificates.